right. Hello, everyone. My name is Desa Cree-Daniel. I am AMCD Professional Development Chair, and we're really excited to have Dr. Christian Chan and Dr. Monica Ban here today talking about career counseling and wellness issues for Asian Americans. I wanted to remind everyone that we are recording, and if you do have questions, you're more than welcome to write them in the chat box, and we will moderate those questions throughout the presentation, or you can unmute yourself and ask your question, but just know that we will be recording your question in the response. Overall, Dr. Monica Ban, she's an assistant professor of counseling at Marymount University, and then Dr. Christian Chan is assistant professor of counseling at Idaho State University. So please help me in giving them a warm welcome, and we will get started.
All right. Well, thanks so much for the beautiful introduction, Lisa. So why don't we go ahead and get started here with, let's see, sure, it's going. So why don't we go ahead and get started probably with our own introduction. So Dr. Monica Ban, I hope that you can start us out.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we begin even getting into the introductions, I want to set an intention, and I love doing this in classrooms certainly, but also with clients, that it's important even before we meet the client, we already know that we are building that rapport and we are co-creating a relationship with them. And so one of the things that I know Dr. Chan and I love doing is making sure that we are in ownership of not just things that we're processing ourselves, but also our intersecting identities as it relates to the systems that we are currently in. So it's very present focused, setting this intention, but it's also a way to address and own our positionality as counselors. So all that being said, some of the more salient identities that emerge for me in many spaces in my life are my identities as a Chinese American woman, a cisgender female, as well as owning that identity as a biracial individual who was born and raised in the United States. So as we're working through this, I'm going to be taking that lens, and that's going to, for better or worse, interact and inform much of my perspective. And I think in knowing that, we have to model that, again, for our students and clients moving forward and being able to initiate conversations about culture. I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit later, but just to give you an idea of where this is coming from. Dr. Chan, do you want to share a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I think for me, there is sort of this richness that I'm a very high context speaker. So I tend to talk a lot about stories and narratives, and sometimes can get a little verbose. So, but I think for me, some of the discussion that we're having, not only about the topic today, but even this reality of intersectionality is something that I very much live and practice by. And so for me, I'm going to be discussing some of those pieces in just a moment, but the reality for me is I centrally live and see the world centrally as a queer person of color. And I think that has been salient to my own intersections. And in addition to that, it doesn't necessarily always tell the full story, right? So for me, I use the pronouns he, him, and his. I'm an assistant professor of counseling at Idaho State University. I teach a career development class. And I also have the honor of teaching our multicultural class at the master's and doctoral levels. And so with that being said, although those are some other fancy job titles and actions, there's also this lived experience that I tend to incorporate into my work, and that sometimes it isn't just about my story, but realizing that I'm negotiating what is happening in that story in tandem with my students and their clients or their students. So with that being said, not only do I identify as a queer person of color, but I use the pronouns he, him, and his. I am a cisgender male. I'm brown. I am a second generation Asian American. with Filipino, Chinese, and Malaysian heritage. And for me too, I'm also the child of two immigrants. And despite that, I grew up with in a middle-class family with multiple forms of privilege, particularly with access to opportunities in education. The other piece that is also central to my experience too is knowing full well that as a cis male, there are so many pieces of privilege to that and the way that I've been represented in the world. And characteristically, something that is also important to my identity, but most people don't often know because unless they talk to me, is that I still identify as someone who is spiritual, someone who identifies as a pluralistic Catholic, particularly centered in liberation theology. So, and in many cases, it's like we're sort of still trying to navigate that. But so many of those identities are complex and enrich the story that we see with our clients, especially as we're trying to build upon this topic today. And our hope is really that today will be a foundation, a catalyst for you to think critically about your own practices, but also figure out how you're meshing together with some of these key points from the literature to understanding and broaching some of these topics with your clients.
Yeah, I just want to add before we also get into this, as Dr. Chan was very articulately had put it, in modeling those identities and that self-awareness and even exploration of knowing that these identities are fluid and they absolutely transform with every interaction that we're thinking about, we're trying to get to a place where we can work with our students and clients to, if not completely understand, but be able to articulate their narrative in these identities and how they may relate to their own lived experiences. So that's the foundation that we're trying to provide while we're looking at this piece of their identity, of this career aspect of their life. And we'll get into a little bit more about a foundation of that. Lastly, I just want to own our assumptions here. Christian and I, we believe that every interaction is a multicultural one. And so it's extremely relevant in this topic for us. But you'll hear, and even in the way Dr. Chan had shared his own identities, that there's a level of complexity when it comes to this idea of power and navigating privilege. And there's this reclaiming sense of some of these identities too. So we hope to get into that towards the latter half, where we're sharing about some, as a clinician, some of the things that you need to be thinking of when you're working with clients, Asian American clients with career issues. Lastly, with assumptions, and I'm Christian, sorry, I know Christian on an informal level, so Dr. Chan, I'm sorry about that. Dr. Chan, I may be getting into this later, but we both know that the blanket or generalization of Asian Americans encompasses many, many diverse cultures, races, and ethnicities, and nationalities. We'll be using the term Asian Americans when we're describing the population, but certainly we also want to put forward that we are aware that this encapsulates many, many diverse range of people, cultures, and heritages. So if you have a specific question about one, please let me know, and I'll do my best to answer. All right.
All right. So, let's keep moving here. So I wanted to add, I think sometimes, as we all know, we've seen, and, just to share some of my own lived experience, as someone who teaches career development, here's the funny part. A lot of people truly figure out, okay, well, how does career development relate to counseling? How does it relate to me? And I think in so many capacities, even as I teach theories of career development and teach about resources and how to practice career development, that actually career development is woven into our daily lives. It is so much a part of who we are. And I think we often make this mistake of saying that career development is sort of the wholly separate idea. And I think for a lot of us, I think especially in the counselor ed world who teach career development, know that career development is fused together with wellness, it's fused together with life satisfaction and career satisfaction. So much of what we see in career development is part of what people experience across the lifespan, right? It's about these developmental trajectories. And I'm loving the comments. Let's see. Yeah, and then I think particularly with so much of what we often see is that career satisfaction is congruent with life satisfaction, right? And that sometimes people who are like our clients and students who are making these decisions that are focused on career and life satisfaction, that they're actually focused very much on their own wellness. And maybe they're not characterizing that way because they've come to you because they're trying to look for a career counseling or even any type of career service. So I want to highlight that because I think in many ways, I think of some different ideas, even just as I taught, funny enough, about John Crumboltz last week and Nancy Schlossberg with transitions theory. And so much of what people are experiencing, right, in life is not only a series of transitions, but I characterize it to my students this way: isn't life this huge, large transition that we're experiencing? And so in many ways, we are moving in, we are moving through, and we are moving out of this. And we're figuring out how to really incorporate life satisfaction as a part of just being. And career satisfaction is tied together with that. So here's some interesting aspects that that we gained particularly from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Pew Research Center, and a few other resources. I think as we understand how career leadership really kind of emerges, and even as we think about Asian Americans broadly in the workforce, we also see that there are different nuances and stereotypes that particularly almost box Asian Americans into some of these categories or box them into these ideas. And sometimes this is where it affects advancement, career development, and Asian American leadership. So often as we see this, right, we're seeing particularly for that often Asian Americans are actually often employed as entry-level and middle management. So it's not that they've not tried to go for like upper management roles, but so far it's the highest representation is among entry-level and middle management in terms of Asian American leadership. And this is especially true particularly within corporate offices. And the other piece too is that, so because of that, there's a very low degree of Asian Americans, particularly in entrepreneurial positions and Fortune 500 companies, right? So they're not usually characterized as Fortune 500 leaders. They're not envisioned as Fortune 500 leaders, and you don't see many Asian Americans in Fortune 500 leadership positions. And there are a variety of different reasons that we could characterize as like how that contributes to the issues. Of course, we can talk very much about racism and stereotypes, and we also, I think we'll get to this in a point, there's also this element of collectivism, right? And I think it's not to say that every Asian American thinks the same way, but I think sometimes it's different in terms of the way that we think about how Asian Americans are seen by others, and how they are othered in that way. So absolutely. So I'm reading some of the comments in the chat too, and absolutely, it's, yep, the bamboo ceiling. And I think that's also parallel, particularly to what we see with the glass ceiling, what has been characterized as the glass ceiling. But I think in many cases, the bamboo ceiling is very much a characteristic term that we use for when we see Asian Americans who aren't in these leadership positions yet want to be there and have the desire to be there and the drive to be there. The other piece to note too is that there are wide ranges of income. So yes, we also, I think because of the heterogeneity of when we see Asians and Asian Americans, particularly across these communities, across these different ethnic identities and heritages, we often see with so many of these wide ranges of income that not only, so yes, statistically, they may, Asian Americans have, yes, the highest rates of income per capita in terms of per household. But the reality is that, yes, there are some who are succeeding, and then there are some in the broad group of Asian Americans who aren't. And so there, you can see that sometimes it's like, you know, in terms of social class, it looks very different across the entire communities. And I think a lot of times, we'll get to this, particularly with stereotypes, it's almost like, you know, in using some of those model minority myths and some of those pieces of the model minority myth, that people often use Asian Americans almost for their own gain by saying, oh, well, nothing's wrong because we've employed somebody who's Asian American, when in fact that has just perpetuated the entire system all over again and really doesn't give people of color, broadly, communities of color, any power in that space. Here's another interesting viewpoint is that Asian Americans, when you compare over a lifetime, can earn approximately $400,000 less than their white counterparts. That is like, I mean, granted, it does seem like, okay, well, over a lifetime, that might not seem like a lot, but I think it's pretty substantial. I mean, that's a pretty substantial difference to me. So, and I think the other component here is that we know that, yes, Asian Americans are also the third fastest growing community in the United States, particularly in the other two largest growing communities are Latinx communities and multi-heritage communities. So those are some particular ideas too. The other stereotypes that are also perpetuated are also the fact that although Asian Americans are achievement oriented, there's also this reality that the model minority myth places them in those stereotypes and doesn't really kind of overlook some of the issues and or the variance between community members. And I think this is also very, very relevant to this next point that Asian Americans, yes, have the highest group of bachelor's degrees, but are also having or also encountering a high incidence of failing to complete high school diplomas. So, and we see that particularly within the heterogeneity of the groups that like sometimes again, like not all Asian Americans are in the same space, especially when we take into account some of those intersections, right? The other piece too, as we think about when we get later into generational status, acculturation, that a number of Asian American youth are actually lacking in preparation for college readiness. So, and of course we can say that that has something to do with socialization or parental involvement, but really, or family involvement, but really it's also about what resources are actually carved out that are culturally responsive to Asian Americans. And so I think those are some of the concerns that we're also encountering as well. The other point that I will also share too, of course, we're going to be probably talking about this as a wider discussion point, as I see with many of our colleagues here today who are talking very much about the bamboo ceiling, the model minority myth, that these also have been used in particular ways to perpetuate racism. And essentially, it's almost like not only racism, but racism is such a broad term because it can include colorblind ideologies. It can include almost like not almost, but it includes microaggressions and explicit racism. So there's so many different ways that racism can also manifest. The other reality too is that there's institutional racism. I think the other component of this, right, is you see who's represented and how they're represented. I think we know this even from social media and media, that there's a lot of ways that particularly Asian Americans have been represented through a particular system, showing that, oh, well, they only belong in these particular occupations. And I'm like, hold up a minute. I mean, what kind of stereotypes are you perpetuating? Or like with the model minority myth, perpetuating particularly in the career context for occupations that they're only like Asian Americans are only good at math. And I'm like, hold up a minute. Like, this is just some kind of like, you have already made assumptions based on your assumptions on achievement and your assumptions based on occupations. And so that forecloses basically a lot of the options that practitioners might be sharing for Asian Americans in terms of career resources. So, and sometimes like unknowingly biased, right? And in addition to that, it also characterizes sometimes that foreclosure in terms of career options, career pathways, and occupational choices, particularly because if that's what I'm being told every day of my life, then maybe that's just, I've assumed it's the norm if I'm not aware of that. And of course, we also know this, I think this comes back again to the heterogeneity piece. As we're seeing like almost this wide pendulum, right? Wide pendulum, we're seeing a lot of swings between ranges of income. And we're also seeing a lot of pendulum swings between education and educational access and opportunity. So I know Dr. Ben, you probably wanted to share something in addition to some of these particular points here. So go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to piggyback off of a few things you were saying as I'm also reading the wonderful comments that keep coming. So please continue to engage with us in this way. This really becomes an issue, as Dr. Chan was saying, when we start seeing it in our offices as counselors or counselor educators, when we start seeing students and clients internalize and truly believe and integrate a lot of these stereotypes as part of their own identities, where that line gets blurred between this is what I want, or what I want, or who they're saying that I am is who I think I am. And then the other thing that I want to add is that, or at least as we're moving forward through this presentation for you all as counselors and counselor educators, and I might even have some school counselors in here, as counselors as a whole, I want you to be thinking about how particularly Asian Americans, when working with Asian Americans, there's almost no in between, and yet you hear that theme a lot when you're working with Asian Americans in the context of counseling, meaning those who may have recently immigrated are moving through an acculturation process or assimilating or feeling in between. Those who are multiracial or biracial are feeling like they're navigating this in-betweenness. And you see this a lot in westernized college campuses as well. And maybe even navigating the generational differences. So there's a lot of in between, and yet we'll also see that, particularly, I love that someone brought up the bamboo ceiling. That is typically reflective or came out of this idea of the glass ceiling, which many of you know relates to cisgender females. And oh, wonderful! Thank you for the recommendation. I'll take a look at that. And my point being is that when we're seeing the bamboo ceiling, we're either looking at women or Asian women as a whole are pigeonholed into this idea or belief that you're either this tiger mom, that you're this perhaps abrasive, non-emotive person who is a workaholic, versus someone who And then you have the other end of the spectrum in which Asian American women as a whole are largely over-sexualized and objectified when we're looking at these intersecting identities. So there's, again, no in between, and yet we're seeing this a lot in the counseling session where clients are feeling this in-betweenness, and we'll talk more about that. Thank you, Dr. Chan.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I forgot I wanted to add one point, particularly surrounding the racism. So again, I think for us, this is also relevant as practitioners who at some point will be helping career development wise, I think in a culturally responsive way. The reality is, I think we should always be familiar with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, because it does, I think in many ways, it prohibits, of course, that particular statute, it prohibits discrimination based on race and national origin. So, of course, that is a law that is placed into effect, right? The other piece I wanted to also share was that in fiscal year 2014, race and national origin discrimination actually comprised 45% of the charges filed with the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Of these race and national origin discrimination cases, Asian Americans filed 1,213 in fiscal year 2014 alone. And that's not that far away from where we are now. I mean, it's 5 years, but it's still not that far away. That was just that recent. So even though, yes, we may see that it's not necessarily going to maybe mass media or the news outlets, but it is happening. And I think it's happening sometimes very quietly. All right, so I think I have two of these quotes up here because this quote sort of characterizes how we can embody intersectionality. I'm going to kind of walk through this. I know it's a lot of text, but I would say really good resource if you're going to sort of implement and understand intersectionality in a palatable way is with Patricia Hill Collins and Sirma Bilge, their recent textbook. It's a pretty easy read, and I would say it's very accessible. Just a quick question, because just to kind of go back to the numbers with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So in fiscal year 2014, 45% of cases involving race and national origin discrimination, it was 45%. And of that 45%, in fiscal year 2014, Asian Americans had filed 1,213 cases of race and national origin discrimination. So, but returning back to this point about intersectionality, so this is also going to contextualize how we think about not just working in a culturally responsive way with individuals, but how we can think about how do we incorporate families, how do we incorporate communities, and how do we really, for me, dismantle a broken system. And so that's what intersectionality here is calling us to do. It's calling us to really reform and understand our complexities, what makes us unique, what gives us these lived experiences, and how they're sort of shaped by systems. I would say this Patricia Hill Collins and Sirma Bilge text has been very accessible. There are a number of beautiful intersectionality texts that I could probably share with any of you if you feel free to reach out to me and send me an email. And I think in many ways, these key concepts are sort of recurrent across multiple applications of intersectionality. And so the first I'll highlight is that you can't be talking about intersectionality if you're not talking about power. That is always a central crux of how we're understanding intersectionality. Of course, the reality here too is we are also focusing on social context. So I think in many ways, a lot of people are like, oh, well, intersectionality, it's always about multiple identities and diverse identities, and actually it is so much more than that. I think in many cases it has been problematic in the way that I've seen intersectionality used as a buzzword, where it's almost just parallel to multiple identities or diverse identities. And I'm just thinking, yes, and. So again, like really focusing on power, focusing on social context. What is the environment? What is the structure? What is the background? And I will say, as I move down to this later, but for example, and you think about the background or the environment, sometimes it is the United States. Sometimes that social context is the workplace that someone is working in. Sometimes it is the school that they are in. Sometimes it is even like the local community that they're in. That can be the social context. How do people relate to each other in terms of these communities? Relationality really focuses, again, like this ties together with that other point of complexity, as you see a little bit lower there. But relationality really focuses on the fact that so many of our experiences, when we think about our different social identities, so when I think of myself as a queer person of color, I can't separate that and just say, oh, I'm a queer person and I'm a person of color. Like that's just not how I live my life. So the reality here is that relationality, the reason why, yes, I'm using that as an example of these interlocking and connected social identities that we live with, right? But that is also a mirror for these multiple overlapping forms of oppression that are happening in a social context. So that sometimes people aren't just literally navigating, they might be simultaneously navigating multiple forms of oppression, or they might not be able to leverage their privilege to know that they can sort of dismantle that form of oppression. So a good example here is like, yes, I may be experiencing racism and heterosexism, and in addition to that, but I'm also a cis male with plenty of power. When people see me, they're apt to listen to me rather than some of my other colleagues who identify either as trans or either identify as woman. And it's like, and I have to also leverage my power and privilege to do something with that, to be able to dismantle what genderism is looking like in that space. The other piece here is related to that relationality is complexity. So with complexity, we're really focused again on the fact that, you know, we are comprised of multiple identities that sort of helps us sort of shift around in the world. So, and I say this to say that sometimes with a complexity piece, because it's not just an additive process. Intersectionality is not just an additive approach. We don't just say, oh, well, you're experiencing racism, genderism, heterosexism, so you just must be more oppressed. And sometimes that's not how it works. Sometimes how it works is that we're navigating the world through different spaces where in a social context, it might be so much more prominent that we could be experiencing racism. And in some other spaces, we may not be experiencing racism, but we might be experiencing heterosexism. And in other spaces or environments, we might be experiencing both. So again, that's the sort of complexity that we're walking through. And that is an intersectional approach rather than an additive approach. So the other piece here is with social inequality. And I would say not even inequality. I know that that's the word that tends to be thrown around. It's also about inequity. Because for me, it is not just about inequality almost says like, hey, we're going to be given the same. It's almost like you're talking about people given the same access, or not even the same access, but that they're given the same resources. So it's like you're going to give a, for example, like a heterosexual person and someone who's LGBTQ plus the same resources, and you figure out that's the solution. In reality, that's not the solution, because we always know that because of history and time and context, that somebody is not going to have power. So somebody who comes from multiple historically marginalized communities may still not have that power despite giving them the same resources. So that's why I'd like to distinguish not only between inequality, but inequity. And of course, a key central concept to intersectionality is social justice. And by social justice, what I mean here is that it always entails action. And that is, for us, consistent with who we are in terms of our professional identity as counselors, and especially for those of us who work also as career practitioners, that social justice, that we are living that. I am going to cite one of my really great friends and mentors, but Dr. Brian Hutchison always talks about this, that career work is justice work. And that is what we're doing, is we're not only just empowering clients or students that we see individually or maybe even in groups, but that we are helping to change the system. And that is what we should also be targeting. It's not just the individual experiences that we encounter, but also the system that we are encountering. So now you're thinking, oh my gosh, I just got thrown all this really rich, some like abstract, ambiguous, all kinds of who knows what. But so you're probably figuring out, how does this relate to career work? And I think in so many, so I think in career work, you're focusing very much on looking at these different places of social context, right? So you're looking at the workplace, and we know this with career work and career development, that it takes place across the lifespan. It's not something that shows up only in college. It's not something that only shows up in the workplace or the workforce, but it shows up even from our earliest experiences, like even as young children. Anne Rowe talks a lot about that, and talks about early childhood experiences as the predecessor for how we relate to our careers. And I think in many ways, as we think about some of what happens here, right, is like, or Gottfredson, who, for example, with circumscription, who talks very much about the reality is we almost like certain roles are given to us because of our specific social identities. And that is sometimes what sets up barriers. And so I think for here, it's also looking at like the workplace, collegiate context, different social contexts, and you're examining multiple overlapping forms of oppression. So I think for us, I think what I want us all to take away from this is to know that sometimes in these career, like for someone who is experiencing the glass ceiling or the bamboo ceiling, or someone who is experiencing discrimination and even implicit and explicit forms of racism. I mean, so microaggressions, but even somebody who is called like epithets and slurs every day that they're at work. I mean, some people, or who are just pushed down implicitly and never really, like, sometimes we're not really conscious that that's actually happening. And I will say this, like with some of those multiple overlapping forms of oppression, that's what we're examining. And we're examining how we as counselors can leverage our privilege to do something about that, especially for like when we think about which privilege identities we do have. And of course, that also affects not only as we think about career opportunities, but health and wellness inequities. You know, I talk so much with my own supervisees that I see in supervision about making sure that where you go for an internship site, that you not only feel safe, but that you can feel well at work. Because if you're constantly battling, oh my goodness, like if you're just battling all this crap where you're like, somebody is basically throwing you under the bus all day, like somebody basically is trying to bully you, you're not going to be focused on work. Can you imagine? Like, you're never going to be focused on working with your clients or your students. And so you're never going to be focused on work. And workplace wellness is so central to this as we think about how it relates to intersectionality and those multiple overlapping forms of oppression. These last two pieces here, I would say with tokenization and oppression Olympics, I think some, maybe not all, I can't make that assumption, have heard about the term oppression Olympics. And I would say with oppression Olympics, there are, the best way that I can put it is that sometimes people are arguing who is more marginalized, who is more oppressed. And I think that doesn't help, because basically we just create fighting across multiple historically marginalized communities, but also it's also reinforcing the same power structure that keeps happening. And so in so many ways, this also defeats the purpose, right, of intersectionality. It's not about oppression Olympics. We're not looking at who inhabits the most oppressed status, we're more so looking about how can we leverage that privilege? How can we overlook our biases, or not overlook, but I would say interrogate our biases in a way that makes sense with how we can not just advocate, but how we can dismantle a broken system. How can we dismantle that form of oppression? How can we then basically use some of our career tools and resources and information to say, you don't have to be the person that this system has tried to push you down to be. And sort of like, that's what we're also encountering too with Oppression Olympics. So I'm gonna keep moving. Dr. Ben, did you have anything that you wanted to add? Oh, okay, I think we're good. Okay, all right. So as you think about intersectionality too, the reality is many of, I think so much of what happens in the workplace or across the lifespan, or even in a collegiate context, or in schools, as we see in the K through 12 trajectory, that so many of these forms of oppression, and this doesn't even cover all of them, but there are multiple forms of oppression that could be overlapping. And I think we see this, and sometimes it's not necessarily that they're all happening at the same time, but sometimes that they are that they're sort of encountered in different ways and at different spaces in time. I think a good example here is, so just thinking about sometimes what I might perceive as, I can't even say like some of the things that have probably been said to me over the past few years, but I think one was, people would often question whether I was actually a professor, like actually asked me, like they really didn't believe me, and they asked me if I was a student, and like, but continue to move, like, and then after I said, no, I'm done with all my degrees, I'm working here as a faculty member, and they still didn't believe me. And it was just like, and I felt like, that's really interesting. So there was sort of this like implicit racism and implicit ageism also happening in that same context. And of course, not only that, it's almost like this whole, this whole idea that sometimes we do encounter this. And I think, we've seen this happen, right? I think, especially as somebody, I forgot to mention at the beginning that I used to work in student affairs and academic affairs. And so I have that particular, my stint there in that background has sort of helped me contextualize some of the programming that is happening at the collegiate level. And I'm almost thinking, hold up a minute, like we're trying to do this initiative that focuses on these communities, but what about some of our students who fall into communities that aren't just consisting of one marginalized identity? So we have to sort of kind of continue to cultivate that space. And sometimes we do that through programming. Sometimes we do that through what career resources are available. So if, like, for example, you're trying to work with somebody in the workplace, and sometimes you might have to help them find career resources that might not be available to them in that workplace because some of it was catered to a single issue. Just like as we're sort of characterizing with Audre Lorde's quote here, that we don't live single issue lives. That's just not how we live our lives. So we can't just focus only on one issue, because, as we think about what Patricia O'Collins says, the time we focus on one issue, we were gonna then encounter a different issue happening here. So I'm gonna keep moving on because I know we're gonna keep moving on time here. All right, so Dr. Ban, start us off here, please.
Absolutely. Sorry, I was making sure I unmuted myself this time. So as we're, man, these video conferences and webinars, they just get me sometimes. So as we're transitioning to think about how we're applying this nice foundation that Dr. Chan laid down for us, we want to begin to reflect on the meaning. This is something that we as counselors as a whole are really good about, that we want to look at career choice, so that not just the kind of cognitive development of that decision-making process, but also the deeper existential meaning to be I like to put it like this to my students when I'm teaching career counseling. I like to say that, when you find that great feeling that you're hoping for when you've invested in all your time and energy into a career, yeah, it's not perfect and it has its ups and downs, but overall, that career choice is a reflection of those values, beliefs, and goals that you have personally. That career identity is one aspect of those intersecting identities that Dr. Chan just mentioned. But we're looking at career on a deeper level. This is our career expression, if you will, our expressive way to show others what we believe, show others what we value, and career is a great way to do this. And so we got to begin to take that mindset, if we don't have it already, as we're talking to our clients in this context about it. And I'm going to do my best to interchange students and clients, but I'm speaking from a practitioner standpoint, so you might see me in the client realm a little bit more. Someone already mentioned this great point of view, which is negotiating, navigating family support systems and other supportive influences if that person lives away from their family, say they immigrated here. What exactly or how much exactly is that collective identity taking into account when making these career decisions? We want to take time to understand the historical narrative involved in that client's own historical and sometimes, if not always, laden oppressive identities as we're working through the history of career decision making. These two are in tandem. And I think about this from a practical standpoint in working with a client who identified as second generation Chinese female. I'm thinking about some of her career decision issues that she had to come up with. And she really was focused on this idea that in her particular culture and context that women are expected to do certain and enact certain roles and be in certain job fields. But her culture shock in acknowledging that this is not necessarily the reality or the attitude that many Westernized and Americanized women have really put her at a crossroads in this intersection to have this, the word I'm looking for is like this reflective process about her own decisions. And this really kind of put her in this, existential crisis, if you will, about, okay, everything that I have experienced and that I've been told that I do believe is now being challenged. And how much of that do I want to own for me and not just for the other people in my life? And so in thinking about that, a lot of that has to do with opportunity, certainly, but we're also looking at things that can become barriers to that. Language, I think, is one that often happens in counseling sessions. Even before I see a client who comes to me with a career-based issue, I explained that, as Dr. Chan had mentioned, that we can't talk about career without talking about wellness as a whole and without talking about other areas of that client's functioning. It's just not possible. And surprisingly, and I don't know you all if you've experienced this and maybe in different forms, but sometimes that can take people off guard. I've had a few instances with clients in which, Asian American clients, in which they come for a career issue and then they realize there's a little bit more there that they have to work through and process when it comes to relational issues or it comes to issues with authority or their own career decision making that parallels their own personal life and characteristics. And that again becomes a conversation about looking outside of this larger narrative to be able to go a little bit back and then before we can even move forward. Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if anyone has also experienced this. I have a very Westernized name, And I've told Dr. Chan this before, it happened years ago, but I was going in for a job interview, and I literally had the interviewer, who was a supervisor there, say that they didn't expect a Chinese person, or they didn't even know Chinese, they just said Asian person, because of my last name. So years and years ago, having gone through that process in therapy, you know, I think about different ways that I could, yeah, right. I love that. I love all your comments, guys, but I think about ways that my clients are also experiencing this overt and covert racism, and how we address that, because I think, as Dr. Chan had put it, this idea of having these positive, and I really strongly sarcastically quote that, right, exactly, strongly, these positive stereotypes actually devalues our position as Asian Americans to be taken seriously in some contexts. And that's where we get into that's that territory of that oppression Olympics, where people don't think, oh, challenge how bad or how good someone has it. Okay, I can go on about all the terrible things that I've experienced, but we won't do that. Let's go to the next slide, if you could, Dr. Chan.
Highlight something. I think,
absolutely.
Yeah, the you know, it's funny because I'm gonna take on, gosh, sometimes I'm really a theories person and I really don't know why, but the reality, you know, with career theories, like I'm thinking about social cognitive career theory. Sometimes, right, like we have contextual factors that influence how we perceive our almost like our outcome expectations, and almost like, so are we able to achieve a certain goal? Are we able to achieve a certain pathway or career pathway? And also that influences our self-efficacy, right? So it almost says like, are we able to do that because this is not what I was told by either my family or by society? Sometimes it's not about your family, like, you know, and I don't want to come from necessarily a deficit narrative, because really, like, not everybody's living that life, right? Like, and we can't just stereotype everybody as living deficit narratives. But the reality is, for in some of these ways, it's almost like sometimes it's not about, like, some of us have very supportive families. And I think in this vein, it's almost like, despite that supportive family, but there's also other pieces of oppression, particularly incorporated already into the system, that nobody really sees. Like, whether it's the workplace, whether it's collegiate context, whether it's sometimes your own, like, your own counselor, your own career counselor, which I hope will not be anybody. So, but it happens. Yeah, and so sometimes those outcome expectations really shift based on sometimes what we experience with oppression. And, you know, I wanted to add here too that career identity is so vital as we think about in the Asian American context, because I think sometimes the value in this achievement orientation is sometimes like higher education and subsequent, like, subtle like employment, any type of employment opportunity. That's why it's always focused on this somehow, like, why there's always a practicality, or like sometimes why there's always this prioritization on higher education or a practical job, is because if your employment opportunities or your career or your education is sort of supposed to help, it's like almost this perspective that you're supposed to transcend or overcome prejudice and discrimination this way. And so I think in that vein, part of that's what's happening sort of in this development of a career identity, a vocational identity. That's sometimes what is happening for Asian American individuals, communities, and families, is that when they think about career, sometimes those values are upheld because this is sometimes a way to transcend discrimination and prejudice. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide.
I want to add with that, sometimes I get discouraged when I see my white counterparts and clinicians pathologizing this type of relationship system with families as a codependent relationship, and other ways of pathologizing culture. And as we're moving forward into this next slide, I want you to be mindful of that, if not to be an ally and a spokesperson to speak out against that, honestly, that kind of leaning towards doing that for the larger system, this larger system being broken. When we're thinking about career expression, as Dr. Chan had put it, we're also thinking about how these intersecting identities are shared with others. So again, keeping in the mindset that as we're moving forward and we're finding, maybe we're finding clients in that position and that exploration where they're not quite sure where they want to land yet, okay? So they're kind of in that pre-contemplation, contemplation stage. We want to reframe conversations in that way to get a little deeper at some of the, in the last slide, some of the values and some of the goals and beliefs that they have as a whole. Also, as I'm talking through this, I'm also thinking that as we're talking about these ideas of privilege and oppression and these dynamics of power, it is generally a huge privilege to be able to do what you want to do. And I think, again, having some not so great past interactions with clinicians and having to explain that not everyone, college is not right for everyone, let alone being able to afford a position in such a place or such an instance isn't the reality of many people who might come through your door. So thinking about privilege in that way might be able to help us provide realistic boundaries and navigate this conversation of needs versus wants and how they often come about in these very minute ways. There is a difference between these things, although when I've had conversations surrounding career identities with my Asian American clients, this is actually pretty enmeshed. This is actually very difficult for a lot of clients, speaking in general terms here, catching myself, but in my experience, that is really hard to navigate and differentiate because there's some individualism involved in that, of course, but there's also some autonomy. That doesn't mean that you're taking away from, an individual, but it could mean that you're challenging those collective expectations. So when I think about needs, and they're both these behaviors and cognitions that create these expectations and boundaries, but there are those that are internalized, right? And we can see that in a really negative and unhealthy, or some would say maladaptive way, when we're talking about like internalized racism, what that does not just to your emotional health, but also to your physical health. But we also see that internalizing could also be uplifting, right? That's that positive self-talk, if you will, if we're thinking on a more cognitive framework. So thinking about what someone needs is typically a necessity versus someone wants. And going back to my initial point about that privilege and doing what you want, there's some levity or freedom that is associated with acting upon those wants. And in many cases, we might just have to, while it might be common sense to us, perhaps, we need to take a step back and acknowledge that this is not always the reality or the privilege or has been the conversation surrounding career in the ways that our clients are used to, our Asian American clients are used to. When we start then, so we start with those general themes, okay? And as we're moving forward to just exploring a conversation about what this looks like and how are they enmeshed, right? Because that's what we're assessing here. We hope to get into a conversation about exploring those desires or those dreams that that client has that's sitting in front of us. And we want to assess or listen for any kind of guilt or shame that is often associated with that conflict of doing something outside of what others expect. And I'm not just when I say others, I don't just mean, family members or immediate supports. I also mean maybe some of that toxic social learning or overall community, particularly when I'm thinking about my my client who was coming in and had this very ingrained idea that women should be doing a certain thing in the workforce or workplace, or maybe not work at all when we're working with clients who have that. And if that's what they truly want, that's why we're assessing this and we're just exploring. If this is what is most authentic to them, then there it is. But if there is that distress, both physiologically and emotionally, we need to be thinking about, okay, what other kind of deeper emotions are associated with wanting to even explore some of these desires or dreams. The guilt in perhaps moving away from your culture and navigating that, as we said it and take it full circle, that in-betweenness that we are experiencing by leveling up, if you will, and moving up the social class when we're sending money home to family who can't afford it. There's a necessity there, but then there's also guilt as well. So it's, again, I'm just trying to lay out the complexity of some of these conversations and what we need to be listening for. We touched on this already, so for the sake of time, I won't get too much into this idea, but Dr. Chan mentioned this idea of othering. We often hear this as whitewashing, but I would say this is almost overly acculturating to a point of dismissing your own identities. Yes, yeah, and as we're moving forward into understanding the realities that our clients have to deal with when they leave our door, our office, we want to also make sure that we're laying the groundwork as far as making sure in our documentation even, and I say this a lot and preach this a lot to all my classes and all my trainings, but we need to make sure that we are laying out that not only does career counseling in those conversations go beyond just the workforce or workplace, but we're talking about it in really a multitude of aspects. We're also going to make sure that we, during informed consent, that maybe we are comfortable as clinicians having a cultural identity disclosure. There are just certain things as a woman of color that I can't hide when I'm with my clients, and absolutely, yes, I'm agreeing with all of these comments here. Wonderful. When we're looking at our own identities and how they relate to our clients, I do have clients that come in and they feel comfortable enough in telling me the first time I meet them, I'll ask what brings you in, or why here, why now, and as we're exploring that, most often they'll say, well, you're Asian. I looked for an Asian therapist. That's important to me. But it has to go beyond that, because my lived experience is absolutely different being a native Virginian than being born in Korea and then coming over, or being a refugee, or experience in English as my first language, and trying to explain that and validate that you are absolutely privileged to have and hold that space, and that be the reason why they're coming to see you, but also ease and temper the expectations that there are a lot of things that you also need education on, and that's where that intersects. Lastly, I'll just say, I don't know about you guys, maybe you've experienced something different, but I've noticed, as we're talking about kind of these common themes down this list, I've experienced a lot of Asian American clients that come in with somatic complaints, as well as career presenting issues, but later to find that there are more and deeper emotional and relational issues. So again, maybe you all are seeing something different, but I seem to find that, and you absolutely want to address the somatic, or I use a lot of mindfulness-based interventions and session, and I do that even when we're talking about career, because when you start talking about this internalized process, for instance, that happens with these needs and wants, and that physiological feeling that someone gets when they experience sadness or guilt or that pressure, they can usually pinpoint it in their body. We're also perhaps breathing, doing breath work in between those, breathing into those spaces, as well as cognitively also talking through it. So we're going to get into interventions a little bit as we're moving forward, but just to plant the seed. Dr. Chan, did you want to add anything?
Sure. So I think, you know, of course, the one thing I wanted to highlight towards the end with career presenting issues and somatic issues, I think this also speaks to sometimes what we see in the literature and what we see in terms of lived experience as saving face. And sometimes, and I won't, you know, we can't espouse that every client will speak to that. I mean, I know, like, for me, I'm very verbal with like my concerns to anybody, but for some they're not. And I think also think about the fact is that some of those bringing up somatic concerns and career presenting issues is sometimes the way for certain clients or students to seek help, or that's the only way they know, because it's like some of the safest ways to ever seek help. And so I think because we know that it's like in saving face, it's about also like how am I transcending prejudice and discrimination in a way that I know is where I could be harmed, or this could reflect poorly on me or even my own community or my family. So in many ways, but it's not to say that everybody will experience that, but that it is something to be mindful of. Let's see, so let's go to sort of our kind of last pieces here for some good ideas. So Dr. Pan, I would like for you to start out, and I'll also add in some points here. So.
Absolutely. So this is, we want to leave you with some things to think about in regards to application. Of course, if you have your own process of integrating intersectionality as a foundation, as well as some interventions or specialties that you go to, think about this for career issues specifically, and then also working with Asian Americans. Absolutely, with any kind of action-oriented, achievement-oriented, often you see this assessment for motivation. But I put this here because counselors, we know to assess for motivation when we're thinking about motivational interviewing, we're thinking about their ability, their willingness, we're thinking about their competence, we're thinking about their skill sets, we're thinking about their personal interests. But I say a big but here because we want to, when we're thinking about it through an intersectional context, we're thinking about the privilege, again, going back to the last slide, of the ability to act upon those wants, which can be very different than other clients that we come across. And there could be conflict there, both internalized conflict and maybe overt conflict between people in their lives when they are already acting upon some of these personal wants and desires in relation to their career decision making. So while we're assessing for motivation, we also want to pace ourselves. And I think that's the point of this this first statement here, is that while we're assessing for motivation, we often think, oh, you know, those, okay, they're in the action stage. Let's go straight into doing some homework in which we check something off and we check their progress. But I'm just thinking about this client that I had, and it was so powerful. She's just a wonderful person, and Asian American woman who I would ask these questions, and she would look at me and say, no one's ever asked me that before, or I've never thought of that before. And that doesn't have anything to do with her ability to do that. It's just that the opportunity and the space perhaps wasn't provided. And so when we're thinking about motivation, we're looking at it slightly different than we are say another population or someone who has this more individualized, westernized, and highly acculturated perspective. We also, if we have time, because I know a lot of clinicians may be pressed for time when it comes to insurance companies, when it comes to the number of sessions they're approved for, just the space they're in. If you're doing career counseling in a university setting, a lot of things can be constrained to that. But if you have time, it's worthwhile to do a really detailed and use the entire session if you can, a guided imagery related particularly to career. And this is really appropriate for career exploration phase, I would say, although you can gain a rich amount of knowledge by doing this and hearing that person's narrative rather than through a questionnaire or worksheet. And it also builds a better relationship, in my opinion. One, I'll give you some details, although we won't have time to walk through the actual guided imagery intervention itself. But you want to be as detailed as to think about when does the client, as they're closing their eyes and they're grounding themselves in their breath, you want to walk them through a work day, if you will. And so you're thinking about, oh, that's my dog. Sorry about that, guys. She was so quiet for the whole thing. My dog people out there. She's famous among the counseling virtual conferences. Anyway, and I'm talking about guided imagery too. This is not very relaxing. When we think about how the client is, thank you, Heather, thinking about how or when does that client wake up? Do they wake up in the morning? Do they catch themselves waking up? Are they making breakfast? Are they sitting down and eating with someone? What time do they leave the house? What are they wearing when they leave the house? All of this detail may seem tedious or very overwhelming at times, particularly for new counselors working through this. But what does that give me? That gives me information as to what kind of job or interest she has, what kind of supports in her life she has, how she finds her morning routine ideally for her when she is going to be walking. Does she walk to work? Does she take the bus? Right? We want to be thinking about some of these things. How is her time spent in the morning when she finally gets to work, right? Is she sitting at a desk? So you're getting really detailed into this guided imagery, and you're giving pauses and time. Now you can choose, as a counselor, you can choose pauses and time for the client to actually speak to you while this is happening and as you're initiating and facilitating this exercise. Or what I like to do is go through the whole entire day leading up to work, coming back home. What time does she go to bed? Does she still use her time as, well, I probably have some counselor educators in here where spring break is just a joke. And you're actually grading and doing a lot more than that. So is she spending her time at home doing more work and responding to emails, or is she going to a happy hour, or is she just unplugging completely, right? So we get the set of the tone of the work environment, the relationships in work, the kind of work people want to do. And this is a really interactive and really nice way of doing that. So that's one I really recommend if you have time. We don't always have that time, like I just said, in some instances. And so we also want to think about using more solution-focused interventions, such as the miracle question, the famous miracle question, or we want to think about journaling. Journaling, I've had mixed results with journaling, and maybe you guys have something you'd like to add in relation to this particular intervention, but it has to have a really good intention behind it when you're assigning some of these things. And I find that when we're talking about or logging in, okay, I applied to this job, or I did this interview, or I'm just going to collect information on that. Sometimes that's helpful. But in cases where you're working with really embedded career identity issues that happen, and we're talking from an intersectional process, most of the time when that I'm going back to this example of internalized racism, but when it becomes a process that is so enmeshed in someone's identity that's causing them distress, journaling about it almost, in my experience, has had some adverse effects in which the person is constantly ruminating about these things, and there's a spike in helplessness and hopelessness and depressive related symptoms rather than being able to. So maybe if you're into journaling, I would take it even further to take on a more narrative technique approach where you're able to deconstruct and reconstruct with the client, but then you're going to have to think about timing in that way. So journaling by itself, though, I wouldn't necessarily recommend in my experience, but it's something to think about. Dr. Chan, I know you wanted to add some things, and I'm going to mute myself so my dog doesn't bark at you.
Oh, no worries. I love your dog. So particularly, I think something that I did want to bring up, I think as you probably walk through all of these different points and all of these different slides, I think one of our best tools that I want to highlight is what Norma Devines and colleagues would call broaching. And by broaching, I think that there's also this sense of broaching and broaching with cultural empathy. And part of what I mean by that is not just knowing, okay, I can sort of, yes, it's not just about openness, but actually being able to understand and know how to effectively bring in some of those conversations that are focused on culture, focused on equity, focused on like experiences of injustice, and what you're doing is you're opening that space for clients and students to talk about some of their career issues that might be related to inequity or injustice or to inclusion and diversity. So of course, we're doing that. And on the other hand, what I'd like to add there too is that some of the useful tools that we know with research on Asian Americans is that there are elements where we sort of sometimes we make an assumption, right, that all our clients know what they want to talk about, and sometimes they don't even know that they're experiencing some of the crap that they're experiencing. And so we can't necessarily just use that. We sometimes have to predict what's actually going to happen. And so not necessarily saying I'm stating an assumption and I'm placing it on you, but knowing how to broach that topic and say, I'm getting the sense that you might be experiencing this issue, and I'm wondering if that's what you, if that's maybe something that you've experienced. And so sort of helping to approach it in a tentative way, but not necessarily to place an assumption or stereotype on someone. And I think with that, it's also, this adds to this idea of critical consciousness. So really helping our clients to prepare for some of those challenging conversations, to prepare for some of the challenges that they might experience with racism, with discrimination, to know what is out there in terms of statistics and career information that might act as barriers to be able to provide career opportunities or even supports that would be foundational for Asian Americans to succeed in that particular workspace. The other piece too, right, so is to help them be conscious that, sometimes this idea of really trying to figure out what career opportunities are aligned with who you are, but also what kinds of pathways are available, you're trying to also help and sort of use that information as a launching point. So using those career resources and information and seeing how that aligns with their cultural values, with someone who is Asian American, what their cultural values are. And so that way, I would say that is also really helpful. I think another piece of assessing for the motivation, I'd also like to say assess for readiness, because I think I often encounter this, right? I think I have quite a few students now in a counselor ed context, but even as I was working with students and clients, the reality is sometimes there is also this space of sometimes our clients and students are not ready. They're not ready to sometimes not necessarily reject some of the values, but perhaps do take part in an action or a step that might seem totally incongruent to their values, incongruent to who they are in this collectivistic framework. So I want to be mindful that to share that you have to assess for readiness too, because sometimes our clients are not ready and students are not ready. I think the other piece I wanted to add too, we need to, speaking of not journaling, but guided imagery, and also thinking about the miracle question. So if we took on maybe a narrative approach to career counseling, there's also this layer of helping people to understand, sometimes what I ask my clients to do is or clients and students to do is name your personal heroes. Name a hero that you would like to emulate that represents who you are. Sometimes that can be as powerful to see someone or like to do research on someone who might represent who you are. And so that way it helps them sort of figure out, like, yes, it seems abstract, but it's just as meaningful to see that there is someone who's like me, or who will probably like, who knows my life, who gets it, who will be able to understand and be able to succeed. And I need to hold on to those models of success. I need to hold on to those heroes. And so sort of, that's sort of a very narrative kind of technique. The other piece too, I think as career practitioners and career counselors, I just wanted to also share that, identifying role models, like, so not only role models that maybe the clients and students have been perceiving as role models, but also helping them to think about potential mentors. So potential mentors that, like, helping them brainstorm potential mentors, or even if you have access or information to mentors, or to informal mentorship programs and formal mentorship programs. Of course, a really great one is our AMCD mentorship program. Shout out to Dr. Tinsley and Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Robinson for the amazing work you've done the past few years, particularly around the formal AMCD mentorship program, because really, like, that is also another pathway to really help clients, especially with different historically marginalized identities, to succeed, to know that, like, there is someone who's like me who can get this. And of course, like, that's how you can also, the last piece I'll also leave too is, so using that career resources and information, I like to always say that, helping our clients, because we have this privilege as counselors and practitioners to really say, oh, well, our client can look up all the information. It's like they can, but they don't sometimes know where to go. And so sometimes I would help clients, like, okay, maybe you want to look at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. You want to look at, like, ONET. You want to look at even, like, what kind of resources maybe that workplace already has or that institution already has, because we don't honestly know until we start looking, and then we're like, let's process some of that information, because that could be the launching point. And yeah, so that's what I will say is, like, use some of those career resources and information in a variety of different ways that helps people to understand, okay, here might be the barriers for Asian Americans because we're not really represented in this particular industry. So certain industries might have more identities or particular communities represented, and others may not. So even helping them broach that conversation is also really useful. Sorry, I know we've gone over time. Yes.
I think, yeah, we're a little over time, so we're gonna, yay, see, it is dog related. Thank you all so much for giving us this time and space. I don't know if there's any other information that our emails are there, so you're more than welcome to contact us. We'd be happy to talk about these things in more detail and nerd out with you about these counseling things.
Awesome. I just want to say thank you so much for having an amazing webinar. The video for this webinar will be on the AMCD website in the next few weeks. And then I will be sending you the CEU link along with the PowerPoint. So you'll have all that information for them. So if you have any questions, you're also welcome to email me. But otherwise, we will see you in the next webinar, which will be Dr. Shrisi Westbunatuji, and that will be happening next week. So you guys have a wonderful rest of your evening.